Step into the museum and there it is, an extremely accurate replica of the plane the Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk. In 1903, of course, it was an astonishing piece of technology, made mostly of spruce with some ash and yellow pine, covered with heavy cotton cloth, and held together by a small amount of metal.
Well, what runs through your mind when you look at that?
Boy, I mean, there's the beginning. There's the whole dream right there. And what always hits me is it's only 100 years, and we're headed for Mars.
The first flight lasted 12 seconds and covered 120 feet. Before Kitty Hawk, there had been balloons and gliders, but never controlled flight powered by an engine.
The world did not know that this was possible. They saw no future in aviation until 10 years later. The Wright brothers were not able to convince people there was a future, but it did change the world.
And 100 years later, we're still fascinated by the two brothers from Ohio who ran a bicycle shop and conquered the challenge of flight on a windswept dune on the Outer Banks.
Oh, that's a very good question. Before we go, he asked, why did they fly in North Carolina?
Isn't it really windy
It's
there?
really windy in North Carolina.
This replica was built right here at the Transportation Museum, based on the original plans from the Smithsonian. Volunteers in the museum's aviation workshop put in hundreds and hundreds of hours. What they created is now one of the gems of the museum's collection.
One of the things the museum tries to do is give you a sense of what life was like 100 years ago. Take this car. In 1903, it was 1 year old, and this was the horn. But there weren't a lot of cars in Maine in 1903. The best guess is, in the entire state at that time, there were a couple of hundred.
In 1903, most Mainers traveled by foot or by horse. Steamships were common. The idea of powered flight struck many as crazy. It was a different world, and the Wright brothers' flights were so low-tech, they needed a hand, literally.
This track was 80 feet long. People stood on the ground on either side, and they ran alongside the plane, holding the wingtips so they didn't dig into the sand and flip the plane over.
And less than a lifetime later, we had flown from Kitty Hawk to the moon, all because of the Wright brothers and their amazing breakthrough.
Neil Armstrong, the great astronaut who landed on the moon, once said to us here at the museum that we're still pulling back on the controls. We're not laying in a cradle like the Wright brothers, but there's very little changes from the Wright brothers to what we have today in terms of the basics.
It is one of the great stories in American history. Two brothers with no formal training and only their own money opening the door to a new era. A century later, we still wonder, why did they succeed where so many others had tried and failed?
I think they dedicated their entire existence to unlocking the secrets of flight. They shunned everything around them. They weren't married. They stuck right to it. And I think it's a lasting tribute, is they stuck to it until it was done.